So now that we have a good foundation in the basics of sound logical reasoning, we're going to turn to a more in-depth investigation of inductive arguments, and we're going to focus on informal fallacies. The purpose of this short PowerPoint presentation is just to introduce you to some basic terminology, and then there will be a subsequent more extensive PowerPoint presentation on our first category of fallacies, which are the fallacies of relevance. So all I'm going to do in this basic PowerPoint is go over some of the key terminology and get you oriented, and then we'll start looking at the various specific fallacies in the next presentation. In the most general sense, a fallacy is an argument that contains an error. There's an error in reasoning. Something goes wrong in the argument, and because of this, the conclusion doesn't follow from the premises. And of course, since we have two different types of arguments, deductive and inductive, the type of fallacy that we could find will differ depending on what type of argument we're going to be dealing with. So why do we want to study fallacies? Well, the most general answer, and I think it's a correct one, is that any argument that contains a fallacy is a bad argument, and therefore the conclusion does not have sufficient evidence behind it such that we should accept it. And so therefore it could be false even if all the premises are true. And since there are two types of arguments, as I have mentioned before, deductive and inductive, we will soon learn that an argument with a fallacy cannot, by definition, either be valid if it's deductive or strong if it's inductive. And so we're going to be studying various different ways in which arguments fail to be strong, since we're going to emphasize informal fallacies, which are fallacies pertaining to inductive arguments. So let's take a look at the two major fallacy categories that we have. Formal fallacies we will look at briefly, and then we'll spend more time on informal fallacies. So the first type of fallacy we have are formal fallacies. And here the word formal means that the argument has a flaw in its form. And so therefore, since form is relevant to deductive arguments, these types of fallacies are the kinds of fallacies we find in invalid deductive arguments. Now, we spent most of the first part of this semester studying the various ways in which deductive arguments can be invalid, and we learned that many types of deductive arguments can be seen to be invalid because they have an inappropriate form. An argument might be affirming the consequent, for example, or denying the antecedent, and therefore we know automatically that it's invalid regardless of what the content is. Now the good news is, since we've already studied that, we're not going to study it again. We're going to focus on inductive reasoning and look at informal fallacies, that is, non-formal fallacies pertaining to inductive arguments. But when we're talking about formal fallacies, those are synonymous with invalid deductive arguments. And again, we've covered that, so we're going to move on from there. Informal fallacies are different than formal fallacies. Unlike formal fallacies, informal fallacies depend on the content of the argument. So when you have an informal fallacy, you have an argument in which there's an error in reasoning that is connected to what is actually being said. In a deductive argument, when there's an error in reasoning, usually it pertains to the form, and what is being said is actually irrelevant most of the time. So informal fallacies are different than formal fallacies. Informal fallacies are found in weak inductive arguments. For many, many years, over 2,000 years, people have been compiling lists of errors that occur in inductive arguments when they are weak, and they've tried to look for patterns of error. And some of these patterns occur so frequently that they have been given names. And you might actually be familiar with some of these names because they're names like the slippery slope argument, or hasty generalization, or the appeal to pity, for example. These are the kinds of things we're going to be studying. We're going to be studying these typical recurring patterns of error that occur in weak inductive arguments. And these are errors that, again, pertain to content and not form, so they are non-formal or informal fallacies. So you might be asking yourself, if these are bad arguments, if these are informal fallacies, errors in reasoning, why should we study them? Shouldn't we be studying sound forms of reasoning? And the answer is, well, I guess we should be studying both. The reason why we want to study these fallacies is because even though they contain a logical mistake or an error in reasoning, nevertheless, they can be very psychologically persuasive. And as a critical thinker, we never want to be psychologically persuaded. We want to be logically persuaded. We want to have good reasons for accepting a conclusion. Nevertheless, an argument that contains a fallacy can be psychologically persuasive. If someone says to you that you should like the Chicago Cubs because if you don't, my brother is going to beat you up, well, that's a pretty good psychological reason to like the Cubs because most of us choose to avoid getting beaten up. However, it can be psychologically persuasive. You might go along with this person because you fear the threat of harm. And so even though we have no logical reason to think that the Cubs are a great baseball team, we might have psychological reasons to go along with someone who's trying to get us to believe that. And so becoming aware of these tactics that people use can make us more critical thinkers and put us on our guard against those who try to manipulate us by means of faulty reasoning. So for most of the rest of the semester, we're going to study various types of informal fallacies, beginning with fallacies of relevance. As we will soon learn, fallacies of relevance are fallacies where the evidence that is given is not logically relevant to the conclusion. As we saw in my earlier example about the Cubs, such evidence may be psychologically relevant, but not logically relevant. So those are the fallacies of relevance we'll be studying in the next lecture. After that, we'll get into some fallacies of weak induction. These are fallacies where the evidence is relevant to the conclusion. However, it's not sufficiently strong to convince us of the conclusion. So these are weak argument patterns, though the evidence is relevant. So they don't have the same type of error as those in the first category. The third category we will look at are fallacies of presumption. These are various types of circular reasoning where you're given what appears to be an argument, but actually no independent reason for the conclusion has been given. So for example, if someone were to say, you should think the Cubs are great because the Cubs are great, well, that looks like an argument. It's got a premise indicator because, but it's not a real argument because you simply cannot give the conclusion as its own evidence. So it's a circular type of reasoning. And then the last group we'll look at are fallacies of language, and these have to do with ambiguity of meaning, where words have different meanings, and therefore we can slide from one meaning to the other unconsciously, causing us to reason in an inappropriate way. So this concludes this very brief introduction to the general nature of fallacies and informal fallacies, which we're going to be focusing on. Now let's turn our attention to this first specific category, which are the fallacies of relevance in the next PowerPoint presentation.